Hi everyone, welcome to the day 3 lecture. This is the millionth time I've tried this already. I have had some technical issues today. I've recorded this entire thing, uh, once all the way through and found out I had no audio. So this time, let's just hope it works and that everything's fine. Anyway, in addition to having some technical issues, have had to adjust and adapt this lecture from what is normally an in-person class with lots and lots of time, 3 hours with everyone in the same room, to something that is hopefully going to be a lot more concise and quick, and also just built for everyone watching it on their own time and following along on their own screen, and then coming back to class for us to all discuss it as a group. So I have cut some of the slides. Also, I seem to not be able to have any of my audio output from any of the videos I want to show as examples coming through on this recording. So I'll just link to some of the videos and refer to some of the stuff that's going on in my examples and hope that you watch those as we go along. Feel free to pause the video and check those out as we go. I will be able to show some examples in class, but you know, some of the clips really do require that we have some audio going. Let's just hope that this still makes sense. Please forgive me if it doesn't. Anyway, let's get on with it. As you can see on the screen, today's lecture is about editing, style, and storytelling. And we're going to start with storytelling and how that differs from story. A lot of the stuff that we are doing as designers, as creators, as fledgling filmmakers right now during this project is going to be trying to get a message across to our viewers or our users or our readers or whatever it is we're making. And as creators, we're going to be making a lot of decisions about how that story gets told. And, you know, for every story, and there's an infinite number of stories out there, there's an infinite number of ways in which you can present that to your viewer. And some ways of doing that really are great at emphasizing the message, the narrative itself. But there are also a lot of ways that might just draw attention to the storytelling aspects themselves, and that's great. There are a lot of times where these things are in balance, and you are using some really interesting techniques to tell a story that still allows for the story to shine, for us to be fully focused, or at least largely focused, on what that message is. There's going to be a lot of times where you want to emphasize the story above and beyond the storytelling side of things. When it comes to design, that might mean whatever your client is trying to communicate to their readers or users or listeners or whoever they're trying to reach, that might be more important than a particular way in which you tell it. Maybe not drawing so much attention to the logo or the brochure or the branding might actually allow for the message or the product to be understood and focused on by the viewer, the consumer. But that said, as designers, we're also creators ourselves. We have a big role in what that message is going to be and how it's interpreted. And so it's absolutely valid and great, in fact, sometimes to utilize your storytelling techniques. Sometimes that can be done to the detriment of the story or the message itself. Sometimes the presentation is the thing that people focus on. I'm sure we've all seen commercials where you thought the commercial was great or interesting or weird or whatever, and by the end of the commercial, when it cut to the next one or you got back to your show, you couldn't actually remember what the product was that it was selling. In that particular case, maybe it was doing more storytelling than presenting the clear message of whatever that product or business or whatever they were trying to sell was in that commercial. So, as creators, as designers, we will constantly be struggling with figuring out how to strike this balance. And there's a wide range of what's good or fine in there, but this is definitely something we need to be thinking about as we're working. And one way to create this effect, be able to make an impact on what that story is. And to be a storyteller is the editing process. Yes, we can do a lot. In fact, most of what we say is probably going to be figured out ahead of time. We're going to be storyboarding and planning for the shots and the moments and the dialogue that we want. And then we're going to be filming using different shot sizes and camera angles and camera movements and different subjects and thinking about all of the different stuff that's going into the camera lens and into the microphone. But even after you've gotten all of that stuff recorded, the editing process still has a maybe an outsized role in determining and controlling what that story is and how it feels. For example, I'm going to have everyone watch this video. Definitely need the audio for this one, but I will have you watch this. It's essentially a retelling, not even a retelling, a re-editing of The Shining, but to make it seem like it's a romantic comedy. It's using only footage from the Stanley Kubrick version of The Shining. It's just repackaging them, reordering them, focusing on certain details, ignoring a lot of other ones that wouldn't work in a romantic comedy, and sort of pitching it with a little bit of music and a voiceover to represent what some of those key moments from the movie, which, if you've ever seen it before, it's a lot of the iconic, really recognizable moments from it, and still make it seem like it's a sweet, heartwarming film instead of a terrifying horror movie. So, editing can have a really big impact on what you are seeing and how you interpret whatever it is you're watching. The main tool editors have at their disposal when we're talking about film and video are, of course, cuts. Cuts are how we get from one shot to another. That's how we determine the transition from a scene or a shot. And there's quite a few cuts. And we're going to go through a handful right now. I'm going to start with the standard cut. And I might jump back and forth a little bit between here and YouTube and here and Adobe Rush to highlight some of these things. But a standard cut is the basic cut that happens when you end one shot and the next shot starts immediately after that. There's not a lot of nuance to it. If we watch this example right here from Dragnet, you will see that as soon as we move the camera over to the other person that Joe Friday is talking to, then we will hear that person talking. There's not a lot of dialogue coming from that, but we pretty much are always pointing the camera and listening to the same thing at the same time, and the cuts happen at the same moment. We just are in camera one, then camera two, camera one, and camera two. That's fine. That's great. In fact, that's something that we should use all the time. But that said, it is very noticeable compared to maybe some of the other cuts that we're going to talk about. It is the simplest and easiest cut. It was probably the only real cut available at one point when you actually used razor blades and were using pieces of actual physical film to create a full movie. But we have more sophisticated things right now. And we want to make sure we use a lot of these other cuts whenever possible, whenever appropriate. The idea, though, is that instead of making something that is just going to be looking at one subject and then another, which feels really kind of jarring, and we notice that a lot more. We are feeling like we're watching a movie rather than feeling like we're in the story. A standard cut can maybe draw more attention to the storytelling aspects of the technical side of things than we want it to. And so what I would encourage you to do is, as you're working through your edits for Project One, think a little bit about how you can use some of these other cuts in order to make some of these transitions a little bit smoother, not draw so much attention to themselves, hide your edits, is how filmmakers often say it, and make it so that people are more immersed in the story itself and less on those cuts, unless you want to draw attention to a certain cut, in which case we've got that covered in just a little bit as well. The first thing we can do to kind of draw attention away from a particular edit is to make sure that we're cutting on action. And by that, I mean anytime you transition from one moment to another within one particular scene, that instead of having it happen when everything's quiet and when people will notice all of the things that might be different from a camera angle to another or from 1 second to another, because you might not have actually filmed these in real time. These might be filmed over the course of several takes. Cutting on action kind of hides that. Let me show you what I mean by that. Go to the Matrix. I will just let this play for a second. But after Neo and Trinity come in, all hell starts breaking loose. And for the rest of the scene, it's basically just nonstop action. And yes, cutting on action here is kind of easy because nothing ever stops. But what I mean by cut on action, maybe in this particular example, is that notice that every time the camera goes from one angle to another, it's almost always when someone's in the middle of a flip, or in the middle of a kick, or a punch, or a shotgun blast, or an explosion, that we are intentionally going at the middle of it as opposed to the end of it. Notice those kicks, that every time we cut, it was just basically exactly as Trinity's leg was striking that poor security guard. But what it's doing is not just making it seem like there's a lot of action going on. It's maybe adding to that a little bit, but it's actually hiding a lot of the inconsistencies and problems that might be happening by combining shots from several different takes and combining them all into one seemingly cohesive moment. So let me show you an example of how well it hides this. So we see right here Neo running over the side, ducks to the ground, and we see him roll around over towards that column and hide behind the column, and then proceeds on. But if you look a little closer, you'll see that when Neo is actually rolling from the right side of the screen to the left and towards that column, he's on the ground. He's basically rolling completely sideways and on the ground level. His highest point is knee height at this point. But as we jump to the next moment, we actually see that he's already standing. Instead of rolling over the top, he is actually spinning in from the side. It's pretty easy to miss that because there's so much going on right then. But also, really integrally to this point I'm making, is that there is a cut happening in the middle of all that movement. It's really easy to be kind of dazzled by what's going on, and our brains can only track so much. So by cutting on action, it hides some of those moments that would be maybe more noticeably problematic if it weren't for the fact that we are kind of just, our brains are caught up in focusing on what's moving and what's changing, and not necessarily on consistency. Another way to smooth out and hide our edits is to use what are called L and J cuts. L and J cuts refer to the fact that if you are using most multi-track video editing software, we will see our video and audio as two separate clips. And I'll show you how to do this in Adobe Rush in just a little bit. But if you have the audio from the first clip, from video 1 for instance, keep going and extend into the time that video 2 is on screen, it actually kind of smooths that transition in our head. Our brains are still left with the being kind of in the last space. So if we go from, say, like a busy city street to a quiet bedroom, for instance, if we still hear some of the traffic sounds, that's going to kind of help us make that transition into the new space and hide the fact that we just had maybe a pretty abrupt change in what's on the screen and what we're witnessing. A J-cut is really similar, just in reverse. What we have with the J-cut is that the audio from the second clip, let's just say the bedroom, maybe starts coming into the audio stream. We start hearing little bits of what happens there before we get to that shot. And by doing that, we are kind of prepping the viewer for what's going to come, or we just sort of start to build the transition into their head before we get there. And it does a surprisingly good job of hiding the fact that that transition was there. We aren't so focused on what's going on. Our brains are confused just enough to not be paying attention to maybe an abrupt change. The first example that I wanted to show for this definitely relies on audio. I guess L and J cut, by their nature, part of it is the audio transitions that are happening. So I'll have you watch this clip. I'll post this one as well. Um, but notice as you're watching it that we're actually getting some of the music from the second scene coming moments into the first one. We're seconds before we even see what's going on. We're actually starting to hear some music playing, and it sets this nice transition. And then we're already in that new space as soon as the two seem to line up with each other. And it's kind of a really artistic and not so subtle J cut, but it still helps bridge that gap in a really cool way. In a more subtle way, and much more common usage of L's and J cuts, this scene from West Wing, similar to what we saw when we were watching Knives Out, the dialogue scene on that porch last class, was that we can actually kind of smooth out a back and forth ping pong that's happening when we're seeing two people talk by including a variety of shots, or by looking at people's reactions while the person who's off camera is still talking. So if you watch this, you'll notice that there's a lot of times where the video cuts before the audio cuts over to the other person, or that we actually start hearing the other person talking and then we start to see their expression a moment later. Quite often the cameras focus on whose reaction might be the most important in that. So there's some very deliberate editorial choices being made in when to cut the video and audio. But over and over again, we're still seeing that the audio shifting at a different time from the video. There's very few times, in fact, that they actually shift at the same time. Makes it so it doesn't feel like we're just doing camera one, camera two, camera one, camera two, but instead it makes it feel like a really natural conversation that we're just sort of standing next to and part of. A jump cut is when you take sections out of a scene or a particular shot and just remove them, and it will mess with time in a lot of different ways. You can either give the impression that time is going a lot faster, a lot slower, is a little bit more chaotic. There's a really good example in the homework I'm going to send for you. I'm going to have you watch one more video from Every Frame of Painting. There's a couple jump cuts in there, but there's one that's really beautiful. Of just makes it feel really chaotic. But like, let's start here. This one, I guess. Little Shop of Horrors. This particular jump cut is intending to make time feel like it's moving extremely slowly by juxtaposing these overly long shots where nothing's going on and it just very subtle movements, combined with these jump cuts where the content gets removed out of nowhere and suddenly we are seeing all three characters in different positions. We're implying that the time is passing very, very slowly and that a lot of time has passed. Yet this whole scene is less than 20 seconds if you take off the view of the clock that we see right before it. But it has a great way of expressing that time. It would be so much more effective than if we maybe just sat with these characters for a minute while they looked bored and not done jump cuts. We got a very, very different sense of time because of that editing style. Similarly, but very differently, is the idea of a jump cut to shift the feeling of time. So even though time might not be passing very differently in this scene, we can see that when Richie's starting to cut his hair and his beard in the mirror, that we have moments where we actually just have sudden and unexpected jumps. Sometimes the jumps are very subtle. Sometimes we're all of a sudden in a different place. All of a sudden his hair is wet and slicked back. I love this shot here in a second when he's trimming his beard. We only cut maybe a second or 2 seconds right after he cuts his side of his hair, but right here, like one, and we cut like 1 second of time, so it's just a moment later. And then sometimes the jumps are a couple minutes. This whole scene could have been filmed in real time and it wouldn't have been that much longer than what's going on right here. Nevertheless, by using editing this way, not only are we able to pass time a little differently, but we're also giving a very different emotional impression to what this time means. It feels, like I said, disjointed. It feels disturbing and confusing a little bit. And so that emotional impact of editing can be a very strong one. So something to consider as you're editing. You take out some stuff from one particular shot and make that shot seem a lot more tight and dynamic, but also control how it's feeling without having to use a lot of different shots. The next cut I want to talk about is the invisible cut. This is something that you'll probably have to plan for well in advance. This is kind of hard to do just in the editing room. This would be something that you have to decide probably as early as your storyboards, that you get the footage properly to make something like this happen. But an invisible cut is when we go from one setting to another in a way that looks as if maybe nothing happened, or that hides the transition from one to the next. We see this sometimes when we see characters kind of walk behind a telephone pole and then all of a sudden they're in a different place, or they walk from one room into another through a dark space, or something blocks the camera for a moment, and then the movement seems to be smooth, but at the same time things have changed from one shot to the next. In this particular example from Birdman, which was written and filmed to seem like it was one continuous shot from beginning of the movie to the end, they still have to change sets a lot in fact. But here we're going from a studio that looks like a bar, walking through this dark hallway where it kind of goes black for a second, and suddenly we appear out on a dark nighttime city street. These were almost certainly filmed hours apart, if not days apart, or weeks apart from each other. And they were also probably filmed in different places entirely. One was probably midday in a sound studio somewhere in LA, and then this other shot it looks like it's very likely actually outside. But in order to make this feeling of it being one cohesive shot, and that the person was, Michael Keaton in this case, is moving from one place to another in real time, they hid the transition with an invisible cut by walking through that dark hallway. The last real cut that I want to talk about is a smash cut, and this is doing the opposite of hiding itself. This is drawing attention to itself. Again, you should watch the video for this, because the examples in the link that I'll show are way better than I could do justice trying to describe, and also the audio is key to experiencing these things. But the point of a smash cut is to make something that is deliberately jarring, to go from a quiet, peaceful moment to a loud, chaotic one, or from a loud and chaotic scene with like 1,000 kids running around screaming to a quiet, meditative moment of a person sitting in a room by themselves. The contrast is what makes this surprising, and sometimes keeping your viewers on your toes, keeping them engaged, is really key to make sure that they're following along, and maybe they are just engaged in a different way, that they suddenly have their expectations shifted in a way that is a lot less passive and a lot more dynamic and interesting. So check out the video for that. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about, it's not exactly, it's a type of cut, but it's not, so it's on every cuts list. I feel like I'm obligated to mention this, but they're generally done. Wipes are essentially the PowerPoint transitions of the movie world. Star Wars uses them a lot. In fact, that's why someone put together a whole supercut of every wipe transition, and this is just episode 4. They go on, and there's so many of them. It's so simple and yet so dumb. Fortunately for Star Wars, which was, it's kind of cheesy. It's a little bit silly in some ways. The transitions seem to work. I think that everything feels a little bit tongue-in-cheek in some of this stuff, especially when it was first made in the 70s. So if you're going to use something like this, it should be appropriate for the content, absolutely. Just, I guess, whatever cut you choose, it should be very deliberate. Anyway, so how would we do some of these things in, say, Adobe Rush? No problem. There are a couple of techniques that you should be aware of that will allow for you to do a whole bunch of kind of advanced editing tricks within Rush's interface. And so first thing I'm just going to describe is this setup I've got right here. I've just got 2 clips, one that has traffic going by on the road and some traffic noises. Again, you can't hear it, but whatever. And then a dog, Berlin, walking around this room. And there's some dialogue going on in the background. There's a little bit of sort of indoor creaky house noise. So very different audio from one to the other, and it's kind of a dramatic shift from one to the other. In order to do some of these tricks that I want to show you, the first thing you need to know about is if you right click on a video clip, you can separate its audio, which means that the audio from this clip is now a separate thing that can be edited, moved, shifted around, and adjusted however you want separately from the video. I'm going to do that for both of these. And now we can see we've got our audio and video separated from each of our clips. This right here, this transition from shot 1 to shot 2, is currently a standard cut. The audio and the video stop and end at the same time for each of these clips, and it's a bit abrupt. It's not too big of a deal. Sometimes that's fine. Sometimes an abrupt shift is actually the appropriate way for us to kind of jar our viewers back into watching it, and that could be okay. That said, if we do want to smooth this transition, if we don't want to make it so surprising, like this feels kind of like a smash cut to go from like a quiet sunny street day to dog right in our face. Maybe we want to smooth that out with, let's just say, an L cut. And so we'll perhaps have our audio from the street moving into the space where we've got a little bit of the traffic noise still in our ears as we enter into this room and stare into this white-eyed dog. So first thing I want to do is give myself a little bit more control. If we click this button in the bottom left, we can switch to the multi-track view in Adobe Rush. Multi-track just means that we can actually layer multiple versions or multiple videos in these tracks up here and multiple audio tracks down here. Now I can actually shift these around. I can actually stack them up so that multiple audio clips are actually playing at the same time. Now, this is not exactly how I want this to work just yet, because I want the audio to still match with this. So I want to make sure those are still aligned. But watch what happens when I shrink this video a little bit. Now we've cut the length of our video, but we've left the length of the audio in place. So now if we were to play this right now, we'd hear still some traffic noises going on well into the moments where we were actually looking at the dog indoors. To make that a little bit smoother, because that might still be a little bit abrupt, to go from traffic noises to all of a sudden, all at once, a creaky noise, maybe someone talking in the background, and also right here for this traffic noise to be going, and then just suddenly drop off. We can fade those at the beginning and end to make those a little bit smoother. The way we do that is maybe not the most intuitive thing, but here it is. If we go to the effects panel, and a lot of these effects are really meant for transitioning between one visual video clip and another, but one of them actually can be used for doing crossfades or just fade out and fade in. If we drag the dissolve option to the beginning or end of any audio clip, that essentially turns it into a fade in or a fade out. And if we want to have the fade happen a little bit longer, we can just extend that. If we want to have it a little shorter, so it's sort of a quick ramp in, but not maybe so abrupt, we can make it a quarter of a second, and it will fade in quickly, but not maybe so jarringly. You won't hear a hard start. Same thing with the, oops, didn't drag it. Same thing with, why am I, okay, there we go. Nope, I'm not getting it there. Please. There we go. Okay. If we drag this to the end of this, we can maybe make it so that as we get into the room, that the traffic noises are still there, but over the course of almost 2.5 seconds, we get the traffic noises fading out until they disappear entirely. And if you could hear it, it would sound so buttery smooth and amazing. So just something to do to make those transitions a little bit easier and less obvious for your viewers. One other thing, just since we're here and we're talking about audio stuff, that I want to mention is that there's also an option for having our audio voiceovers, our foreground audio, not necessarily interfere with any background music that we've got going on. If you add a soundtrack, which you should be doing for both your B-roll and for Project One, and put that in here as another track layer for audio, you can go to the audio tab, make sure it's set to music, and click the auto duck thing. If you hover over, it actually gets a little description, and you can actually see a visual portrayal of what's going on. But essentially what the auto duck feature does is it will look for any clip that has voiceover. For instance, this one right here where we have a woman's voice talking in the background, it's set to voice. It detected that automatically. We could deliberately choose that if it weren't automatically chosen. But anytime someone's talking, Adobe Rush will detect that and automatically decrease the volume of our, you can see right here, it ramps it down, automatically decrease the volume of our soundtrack so it doesn't interfere with, doesn't conflict and try to overpower what people are saying. So it will automatically figure that out and adjust accordingly. It's really handy, very convenient, very easy way to accomplish that effect. All right, so I've got a couple other videos that you can watch if you want. I just wanted to mention that with regards to the story versus storytelling, I wouldn't say it's a debate, but that decision-making process for how much of what to include and how much of the story and message to emphasize, that there are plenty of people, especially in film, who are intentionally playing up the storytelling side of things. That they have chosen styles. They've got a style themselves that is quite often emblematic of who they are. That does emphasize the storytelling side of things. Wes Anderson, the link that I've got to right here is a supercut of supercuts. He does so many things that you will see from one movie to the next that some people might describe it as gimmicky or formulaic or repetitive, but he executes them so well, and he does them all so deliberately and with sound intention that they often work. You may like or not like his work, but nevertheless, he has a very distinct style that is very easy to understand and can really affect what we experience as we watch one of his movies, how we get that story. Similarly with Quentin Tarantino, some other supercuts going on, just pointing out that you can actually see, if you look at one of these things, how often they use some of the same techniques to achieve a certain effect. And it's good just to be aware of what those are and how those affect the story, how they affect our feelings as viewers. But anyway, just to point out some of the things that we could do if we're thinking about those things really deliberately like these filmmakers do. All right, that's the lecture. I will probably go over the homework in class as well, but I just also wanted to say real quickly that you should watch the video that I'm going to post in the homework post. I won't be posting any of the stuff until Tuesday, but I'm going to share a video. I want everyone to look at a scene from a movie or show and analyze how the filmmaking choices, the filming, the cuts, the edits, the camera movements all impact what the story is and how we feel about it as viewers. Keep working on your script for Project One. We are going to be filming this next week, so you want to get everything as far along as you can, and then with your updated script, knowing as close to the finished product as possible of what your script is, updating your storyboards so that you really have a good sense of pacing and timing, because a lot of times we'll have an idea of what our story is going to be, make our storyboards, and then not realize that, oh, I wrote 2 paragraphs for this one frame. That's a long time for us to just sit on one camera shot. So maybe coming up with more shots to accommodate the actual length and speed of your text. Anyway, again, I'll go over this more in class, but that's the lecture. See you in class.